Last week I did a short about how long I think Boba Fett was in the Sarlacc pit, and I got a lot of responses to that. People have very strong opinions about this, thinking that Boba was in the pit for months or maybe even years. So I figured it was worth taking a longer look at the timeline of the flashbacks in the series, especially now that we might be done hopping back into the past. How long was Boba in the Sarlacc? How long was he with the Tuskens? And how long was he alone before meeting up with Fennec Shand, catching us up to the time of the Mandalorian? First, I want to point out that I don't really think we're meant to know. I think they've kept the whole timeline kind of vague on purpose, even with The Mandalorian. We're told that that series takes place about 5 years after Return of the Jedi, but I think Lucasfilm is trying to keep the timeline flexible. The more specific they get, the more locked in those events become, and maybe they would want to shift it around in the future. Maybe it makes sense for it all to take place 4 years after Jedi, or 7 years, and they want to be able to do that instead of setting dates in stone. But we're nerds, and we like our timelines, so I'm still gonna do my best. So how long was Boba Fett in the Sarlacc? In my short, I guessed about 2 hours based on a Legends reference guide that says his helmet has 2 hours worth of reserve air inside of it. In the episode, we see him wake up, and air is his primary concern. He gets air from the stormtrooper and then burns and digs his way up to the surface where it's daylight. He passes out, and then Jawas arrive when the sun's set to take his armor. Now, do I think he was definitely in there for exactly 2 hours? No, that's just a guess based on information that, admittedly, is not strictly canon anymore, but it's also not been contradicted anywhere. I saw 3 main arguments responding to my short about this whole thing. First, people claimed that Boba Fett said he spent years in the pit in Chapter 4 of the Book of Boba Fett. No, he said he was in the pit all those years ago. But what about the fact that the Sarlacc digests people over the course of 1,000 years? Doesn't it keep its victims alive? I was under that assumption, but it would appear that's not the case. That stormtrooper was definitely dead, and whatever chamber Boba Fett was kept in didn't seem to have any air in it. I guess the Sarlacc takes 1,000 years to digest what it eats, but it doesn't keep it alive for that length of time. Finally, people claim that the sail barge should still be smoking if Boba escaped only a couple hours after the battle, and you can see that it is still smoking during the night scenes when the Jawas show up. Why isn't it smoking during the day? I have no idea, but I don't think the Jawas would have wasted any time scavenging that wreck, and Cobb Vanth's story about getting the armor takes place very shortly after the Battle of Endor. He says he wandered the desert for days after the destruction of the second Death Star, so I think Fett must have escaped the Sarlacc very shortly after he fell in. 2 hours makes sense to me, but I'm not going to split hairs here. We're talking about hours or days in the pit, definitely not months or years. I think most of Boba's time was likely spent with the Tusken tribe. That makes the most sense to me for how important the tribe became to him. Again, this is all very ambiguous, and I think it's important to remember a couple things when discussing this timeline. First, the series creators are more concerned with showing us the most significant moments from Boba's time with the Tuskens than they are with creating an accurate and concrete timeline. Walking away from this story, we need to know that Boba was enslaved by them, earned their respect, helped them fight against the Pikes, became accepted into their tribe, and then witnessed the aftermath of the tribe's murder. Those are the character beats that shape who Boba Fett becomes. It all feels like it happens very quickly, but we could assume that there are time jumps in between every episode. Also, we're being shown all of these flashbacks through dream sequences, and I think that's a reasonable way to show us all these events without them having to be a completely accurate timeline. Boba's experiences with the Tuskens reminds me of The Empire Strikes Back, where if you compare Luke's time on Dagobah to Han and Leia on the Millennium Falcon, the timeline of the movie starts to make less and less sense. There are ways to rationalize the discrepancies, but my point is that the Star Wars films aren't always about establishing a perfect order of events. They're often more focused on telling the best character stories they can, and then nerds like me come along and we do our best to make it all match up later. So I'm gonna just guess that Boba was with the Tuskens for anywhere from 2 to 4 years. Does that mean he wore that same jumpsuit 4 years? Yeah, I think it does. Fennec Shand hasn't changed clothes since the Clone Wars, so I'm not gonna judge Boba Fett for his wardrobe choices. After the deaths of the Tuskens, Boba spends some time alone, wandering the desert and waiting for a good time to sneak into Jabba's palace to steal the Slave One back. And I'm just gonna guess that lasted 1 or 2 years. When we catch up to him in Chapter 4, we see him meet up with Fennec Shand, and that takes us all the way to the time of the Mandalorian, 5 or so years after he first fell into the Sarlacc pit. That's when they go on a little revenge tour together. They steal back the Slave One, they wipe out the speed bikers, and return to the Sarlacc, and that's when he says, "That's where I was trapped all those years ago." That line is the best indication the series has given us about any sense of a timeline. The creators are telling us that yes, it has been years, and that's all we really need to know, because as much as I enjoy knowing the order of events, it's just not important to the story being told. We need to know what events changed Boba Fett from who he was to who he is. We don't need to know exactly when everything happened. I bet a reference book will help nail it all down later, but for now my best guess is that he spent a brief amount of time in the Sarlacc pit, then most of his years with the Tuskens, and some months or maybe a year or two alone until he met Fennec, and that catches us up to the Mandalorian. So that's it for today. Does that timeline make sense to you? Let me know in the comments. If you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the channel to keep up with all our Book of Boba Fett coverage, and consider checking out our Patreon page for even more. We're releasing video reactions and audio commentaries for every episode as they come out. As always, thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.